Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. We are in the first full week after the election, and we are seeing a rash of lawsuits filed by the Trump campaign challenging the voting count, the process, all kinds of allegations of voter fraud, none of which have been filed, frankly, with any meaningful evidence, and most of these lawsuits are being thrown out pretty quickly. But nonetheless, it is creating a real question about the purpose of these lawsuits, the impact that they are having on the integrity and the perception of the integrity of our process, confidence in our electoral system and in the courts, and the topic we're taking up in this episode of Good Law, Bad Law, the role of the lawyers bringing these cases. Some lawyers affiliated with some big law firms, and also lawyers involved in more activist type groups that are assisting the Trump campaign in the bringing of these lawsuits. What is the role of the lawyers in this case, and what are the limitations? What should be the limitations on lawyers if they're following rules of ethics and professionalism? My guest, Scott Cummings, discusses this with us. He's got an incredible background in the area of legal ethics. He teaches the ethics of law at the University of California Law School. He's written a couple of textbooks on legal ethics and is very concerned in his research, his writing, and his teaching about these very questions. This is a really disturbing time, I think, in our country, and we need to understand what's happening and ask tough questions about why it's happening and what should be the consequences of those who are facilitating knowingly the undermining of our democratic institutions. So with that in mind, stay tuned for this episode of Good Law, Bad Law. I want to welcome my guest on the podcast today, Scott Cummings. Scott is a professor of legal ethics at the University of California, Los Angeles Law School, and has written extensively on law, legal ethics, and the profession of law, including textbooks. One of the leading textbooks called Legal Ethics, another that he's edited called The Paradox of Professionalism, Lawyers and the Possibility of Justice, and has also worked a great deal in the area of public interest lawyering and trying to understand how to get more law students into the public interest sector of the legal profession. So Scott, I'm sure I left out a whole bunch about your background, but thank you so much for joining us to talk about this issue today.
Thank you so much for having me.
We're talking about this post-election holding pattern of the sorts that we're in, where we have a clear winner of the presidential election. I don't think any rational or reasonable person can, at this point, argue with the fact that Joe Biden is the president-elect and will be the 46th president. But meanwhile, President Trump has not conceded and has filed just a wild smattering of lawsuits in some of the key states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Arizona, Georgia, and so on, challenging the results in those states and alleging all sorts of voter fraud. Some of the attention has been on the two leading law firms who are representing President Trump in these cases, two Ohio firms actually, Jones Day and another firm called Porter Wright, large law firms, national and international law firms actually. Maybe you could just help set us up for this discussion and what the issue is, and why there's been this focus on the role of the lawyers representing the president, and then we can get into some of the details of that and some of the twists and turns as a legal ethics issue.
Sure, thank you. That's a great overview. And let me just start by saying that although a lot of attention has focused on the controversy swirling around the sort of prominent big law firms, Jones Day in particular, but also Porter Wright, Jones Day involvement in the actual lawsuits has been, as far as I can tell, non-existent, although they have been an advisor to the Trump campaign and represented Trump for the last few years, they actually, for reasons that might relate to the dubious nature of some of the lawsuits, not been directly involved in filing them. Instead, if you look at the lawsuits themselves, most of them, some of them have been filed in connection with Porter Wright, but most of them have been undertaken by small firm and some nonprofit lawyers even that are scattered throughout small towns that really form the heartland of Trump support. And at least in the case of the nonprofit lawyers, they're ideologically committed to the Trump agenda. And so it's an interesting group of lawyers that I think one could talk more about, but they're really the ones that are being mobilized to advance these claims.
So what is now the Jones Day law firm? I know a number of the partners have connections to the Trump administration. Don McGahn, for example,
right,
some may remember as having a pretty prominent role in the Mueller investigation and the subsequent impeachment proceedings, came into the White House and then returned to Jones Day. And there have been others too in the firm. That's not unusual. I mean, there's been stories in recent days about how the Biden transition team is looking to many large law firms for not only legal support, but for roles in the transition team and possibly roles in the future administration. So there's nothing unusual about that aspect of this, right?
Oh no, nothing unusual at all about their involvement. I think as you and probably the listeners know, there's been a lot of controversy about Jones Day's involvement potentially in these direct lawsuits challenging the validity of elections across these battleground states. And I think one could speculate that it's precisely for that reason that Jones Day isn't actually touching the lawsuits themselves, in part because, again, the claims in many of them are dubious at best, and there's been a lot of pushback by clients not wanting the firm itself to be involved in these kinds of cases. And so, although the firm is playing an advisory role to the campaign and has, in a very legitimate and conventional way, provided legal support to the Trump administration over the past few years, they are not involved in these cases, and I think that's an important point to make.
Right, and that raises a very specific point of law, actually, and of legal ethics, which is when a lawyer or and his or her law firm actually puts their name on a court filing. That is significant in terms of a professional responsibility that a lawyer has. Can you talk about that and distinguish that from what you've told us about Jones Day's role as an advisor?
Yeah, and so I mean, there are a couple of different dimensions to it. One is that it's perfectly legitimate for law firms to bring cases, obviously, and even bring cases that they may think that it's more likely than not that they're not going to win. But that is not what's happening here, at least in many of the cases. And I think to the contrary, the actions of the lawyers representing the Trump campaign across the battleground states suggest that the lawyers have crossed some fundamental professional lines that are dangerously contributing to the campaign's overall bogus and completely illegitimate claims of election fraud, and thus really promoting the erosion of trust in the democratic system. And so, there are specific ethical rules that prohibit lawyers from bringing what are essentially frivolous cases and to bring claims within cases that are unsupported by law or fact. And so there's a specific a model rule 3.1, which is directly on point in this regard, that states specifically that a lawyer shall not bring or defend a proceeding unless there is a basis in law, in fact, for doing so that's not frivolous. And the rules and the comments suggest that it's of course true that lawyers don't have to ensure that all facts have been fully substantiated before bringing a case, but they do have to inform themselves about facts in their client's case and the applicable law, and they can't just bring cases that don't have an informed foundation in fact in law for bringing them. And I think if you look at a number of the cases, and there's been a fair amount of good reporting on this in the media, there are many specific instances of what I would view as specific misconduct by lawyers, which include filing factually unsubstantiated claims and misrepresenting the law in ways that I think would arguably rise to a violation of this particular rule.
Well, and this isn't new even in the broader context of the election campaign, and now what we're seeing. In other words, these lawsuits that allege voter fraud, that allege fundamental flaws in the election process, the president and this administration have been making these claims since he became president. I mean, he was claiming that the 2016 election was rigged, even though he won it. I think maybe because he was unhappy he didn't win the popular vote. And there was an election, or rather a voter fraud commission that the Trump administration assembled to gather evidence of voting fraud around the country that ended up going nowhere. And I'm also thinking in Pennsylvania, where I am, there was a case brought in advance of the election itself in which they alleged there was going to be this widespread voter fraud because of the reliance on mail-in voting.
Right.
The judge in that case said, listen, if you're going to bring this claim, you have till next Friday to come forward with any evidence you have, or I'm tossing your case.
Right, right.
Forward with no evidence, and the case was dismissed.
Look, I mean, I think there are, in my view, three different levels at which to analyze and judge the conduct of the lawyers who are bringing these cases. Again, mostly unsubstantiated cases across the battleground states to sow distrust in the results. I think the first level is just looking specifically at myriad instances of specific misconduct by lawyers in relationship to filing frivolous claims. And I think we could have a discussion about that. And there is ample evidence in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and other states of unsubstantiated claims and misrepresentation of law, particularly around the right of poll watchers and poll challengers to participate in the process, which has been a significant theme in the lawsuits, but also in the general public narrative around the coming out of the Trump campaign around the illegitimacy of the votes, oftentimes distorting what the underlying legal standard is, because although poll watchers do have the right to be there, the campaign doesn't have the right to have as many people as they want in the room. And that's been one of the bogus claims, I think, that has been put out across a number of different jurisdictions. But we could just talk about specific instances of misconduct in relationship to filing claims that do not have a basis in law or fact. But as you're suggesting, I think it's incredibly important to also look at these cases in the context of this broader effort by the Trump campaign, as you mentioned, over many months and even years now to really perpetrate what I view as an unprecedented fraud. And I think what most objective observers view as an unprecedented fraud on the American public by claiming without an iota of credible evidence that there's been massive voting fraud, unseen in American history, without which he would have won the election. And as you make clear, I mean, this is a claim that has been put out by the campaign prior to the election, in which the president essentially argued that if he did not win on November 3rd, it was because of voter fraud, not because the voters selected Joe Biden. And I think this has been a coordinated effort that has predated the election and now is going on after the election and has resulted in his refusal to actually concede the election. And in addition to putting out claims that are false about the validity of the election through Twitter, through Facebook, and other media outlets that have charged things like corruption, tampering with the election. He's denounced on Twitter the cesspool of fake votes and promoted the mail-in ballot box hoax to steal the election. All these are quotes from his Twitter feed. And I think the lawsuits have to be looked at in relationship to this broader effort. And it seems clear, I think, if you do, that there is coordination between the campaign and the lawsuits, in the sense that the ground was laid for the lawsuits prior to the election itself. And a lot of the facts and legal claims that are coming out of the lawsuits, even though in many instances they're unsupported, are then being fed back into the media campaign designed to sow distrust about the outcome of the election. And you are not allowed to assist your client as an officer of the court in perpetuating the fraud. And you're also not allowed to bury your head in the sand in the face of obvious facts that a fraud is occurring. And I'm just not sure how this is not a massive fraud in the American public that is being facilitated by the filing of these lawsuits. And you can look at specific instances where Trump in his Twitter feed is actually pointing to legal claims and facts coming out of specific lawsuits. He has a Twitter feed from November 9th when he says Nevada is turning out to be a cesspool of fake votes, and he points to some claims by a former Nevada Attorney General named Adam Paul Laxalt that claims that there's been voting fraud, and he said it's absolutely shocking, et cetera. So there's this relationship between the legal team in these in many respects in these lawsuits and the broader narrative that's coming out that is deeply linked together, and again deeply troubling from the point of view of this idea of assisting your client in committing a fraud. And I just think, given the extraordinary nature of what's happening now, the extraordinary nature of this election on multiple dimensions, that there has to be a higher standard for lawyers to bring these claims in a context in which they know or should know that they're being mobilized in order to advance this fraudulent claims by the Trump administration.
And I want to come back to that idea of what could be the consequence to those who participate in and facilitate these particular rash of lawsuits now in this time that we're in. But before we get, I wonder if there's any precedent for this at all, because I mean, clearly these lawsuits are being filed in pursuit of a political agenda, right? I mean, he's hoping either, and we don't exactly know what the motive is. I mean, is it really that he seeks to overturn the vote and claim a second term, or is this somehow sowing the seeds of some future political ambition, or maybe a media company? You know, we don't really know for sure, but there's clearly some political purpose for those involved. But that in itself is not unprecedented in this country, from either liberal or conservative, from left or right. I mean, the ACLU, has pursued an agenda in support of the First Amendment by representing all kinds of people that were very controversial at the time. He represented Nazis marching in Skokie. The civil rights movement used the courts and looked for cases to advance a particular social political agenda. You can see that on the so-called right as well. So-called pro-life groups kind of figured out that they could set up advocacy groups and file lawsuits to advance their agenda when it comes to abortion, just to give one example. So pushing or lawyers involved in lawsuits in cases in court to advance a social or political agenda. There's nothing new about that, even where you're taking a controversial position or representing a controversial client. Somehow this feels of a different order of magnitude, though. And you've alluded to it and said so, is because there's no evidence. There's just nobody has been able in any of these cases to produce any evidence whatsoever of voter fraud or anything other than allegations, which then do kind of circulate in and around back to this person's Twitter feed and then back to this broadcast on Fox News, and then out. That's how this takes on a life of its own, and why I think we all believe it's potentially so dangerous. Is there any precedent for what we're seeing in the way the courts are being used, so that maybe we can look to that example and maybe see what could happen as a consequence of those involved in these cases?
I mean, I don't think so. I mean, this again is the most extraordinary election of my lifetime, without question, and maybe the most extraordinary election in the history of the Republic. And it's obviously true that lawyers across the ideological spectrum can and should bring cases that are designed to reform law, change law, advance legal principles in ways that deepen our democracy and to promote the expansion and inclusion of groups within the political process. That's something, as you note, that has happened throughout history and dates back to the civil rights movement and has been mobilized by conservative public interest organizations as well. And I think that's all good and legitimate. I think what we're seeing here is different in kind for two important reasons. One, as you alluded to, the claims that are being made in these cases, in many respects, do not have factual or legal support and are being made, as I speculate that they are being made as a way to coordinate with the broader public relations campaign that the Trump administration is putting out to delegitimize the 2020 election. And, that has, as far as I know, and I've studied this issue quite a lot, has never occurred. And it's a massive breach of public trust. I think there's no way around that. And again, you can look at, and we could talk about specific cases where lawyers are making unsubstantiated claims of deliberate and systematic misconduct by local election workers and poll workers, not supported by evidence. There are myriad claims in this regard, and I think that is what feels different in kind, and just in terms of the aggressiveness and the degree to which the claims are untethered to truth in so many instances. I think that the other issue is just, again, context here. The argument that's being made out of the Trump administration and campaign is that every vote legally cast should count and none others, and that they have the right to file challenges ensuring that happens. And I think at some level that's true, but this is subject to context. And even if you would grant that some of the lawsuits are not frivolous, which I'm not sure I would, they have no chance of changing the outcome of this election. And again, it seems clear that the client is using them to sow distrust toward the end of potentially refusing to concede and vacate the White House. And I think in that context, the act of filing what even could be arguably claimed to be technically legitimate lawsuits becomes something much more serious and inappropriate. And I think that is also something that just feels very, very different in ways that raise substantial questions about the legitimacy and appropriateness of the lawyer's actions. I would just, in putting my my legal ethics hat back on, the rules have very specific mandates about what you can and can't do in filing lawsuits, and we've mentioned a little bit of those already. But they also have quite a broad principles that are advanced by becoming a professional, becoming a lawyer. And one of those principles, to quote the model rules, again, the ABA's standard for professional conduct, is that a core duty of a lawyer is to further the public's understanding of and confidence in the rule of law and the justice system, because, and I'm still quoting, legal institutions in a constitutional democracy depend on popular participation and support to maintain their authority. And I just have a hard time understanding how the lawyers filing these suits are not violating that principle in such a profoundly important moment in American history.
Well, and the media is doing a terrific job, I think, so far in investigating and trying to get to the bottom of these allegations as they're coming out. I mean, there's clips on news, people who are held out as whistleblowers who actually witnessed nothing firsthand or who don't have any evidence, or
right.
There was one that was a claim of 50 people who apparently were deceased but had voted, and then
Right.
they looked into that, and actually none of them were deceased and voted. They were, they figured that out. But there was one particular moment that I think really gets at what you're saying, that I think perhaps a lot of non-lawyers don't understand about lawyering and about the role of lawyers, which is that lawyers aren't just hired guns for their clients. They do have a role as officers of the court, and that has, or certainly should have, deep significance in the system. There was some exchange that we saw an excerpt of the transcript, and I think it was in a Pennsylvania case, where the issue is, as you mentioned earlier, was how many observers did Republicans and Democrats have inside the spaces where the votes were being counted. And the lawyer for the Trump campaign was really bobbing and weaving around the question. And the judge finally said, "I'm asking you as an officer of the court, how many people did your side have in the room?" And the answer was something like, "Well, it was a non-zero number."
Yeah, right. That was the campaign challenging Philadelphia County Board of Elections filed on November the 5th by Porter Wright. I think that argument was with a lawyer who was affiliated with Porter Wright named Jerome Marcus from Marion Station, Pennsylvania, who, again, in the lawsuit, they, I think, lie. I mean, the claims that are made in the lawsuit, if you look at it, are that the County Board of Elections in Philadelphia is intentionally, I'm quoting, intentionally refusing to allow any representatives and poll watchers for President Trump and the Republican Party. Again, intentionally refusing to allow any representatives. That is a statement directly from the complaint filed on November 5th by Porter Wright and Jerome Marcus. But then, as you mentioned, in hearing, the lawyers admit to the fact that, in fact, there are Republican representatives and poll watchers in the room. And so I just don't know how that gets squared, right? Going back to the idea that you cannot advance legal claims that do not have factual support and that represent the law accurately. I don't know how this isn't a violation of that rule.
So where do you see this going? I mean, the lawsuits have been many in number, but have been, I think, zero in success. I mean, there hasn't been one of them yet.
I mean, there are a couple that are, sort of marginal successes around, there are a couple that allege sort of technical violations, like votes get counted that have some error in terms of the declaration statement, or the envelopes aren't correctly sealed. And there have been a couple that affect a few hundred votes here and there that have gone in the Trump campaign's way. But again, nothing at the level of voter fraud. I think that's the important point to make. The big claims in these lawsuits across the battleground states is intentional, nefarious conduct that has resulted in disenfranchisement of Republican voters in a fraudulent manner. And none of those claims, to be very clear, have had any success at all. And as you just suggested, in many cases, the lawyers have had to sort of walk out of hearings with their tails between their legs because they've been called on the invalid nature of the claims that they're making. And so I think that's a super important point to emphasize.
Well, but when a lawyer signs his or her name to a filing in court and it's challenged and it is alleged to be frivolous. I mean, there are rules in state court and federal court. Federal court, it's called Rule 11. There are rules about what obligations a lawyer has to not file frivolous claims or make knowingly false statements to the court. When that happens, a judge has the ability, and sometimes does, sanction the lawyer. That could be a monetary penalty. That could be a referral to a disciplinary board in the state where that lawyer practiced. So there are those remedies for for a lawyer's misconduct in terms of frivolous filings. But there, I imagine, is also some tension because, as we've been saying, there are times when a lawyer, on behalf of the client, files makes a filing in court to push the law, to test a novel idea, to expand the law in a way it isn't currently, maybe to make an argument, though, if not accepted in this case, may influence a judge in a later case hearing. You know, there are ways in which the law legitimately and validly can be used in that way. So how do you see this playing out? And you've described it as unprecedented. You know, how many times have we said, where is the outrage over this or that that's happened in the last 4 years? Do you think judges in some of these cases will be outraged enough, not only at the allegations, but at the obvious design of some of these lawsuits, which is, as you say, to undermine confidence in the legal system, undermine confidence in the electoral system in the country? Do you think some judges will have a level of outrage sufficient to actually punish some of the lawyers involved in these cases?
I mean, I would hope so. And again, I think that what we've seen, I mean, there have been examples, and we've touched upon a few of them, of judges at least being extraordinarily exasperated. You have multiple examples of curt dismissals of lawsuits seeking to stop voting counts in different jurisdictions that are issued by Republican appointees and Democratic appointees alike. We have the exasperated response by the judge in the Michigan Benson case, where you have the law firm bringing a claim that Republican poll watchers have been excluded based on hearsay evidence from an affidavit saying that someone told the affiant that they were excluded, in this back and forth, which I think lots of people have viewed. It's on YouTube, between the judge and the lawyer around sort of basic one-on-one concepts of hearsay. And that was clearly a moment, I don't know if you can call it outrage, but it's clearly a moment of high exasperation, and leading to a very curt and pointed dismissal of that claim by the judge. And I think it's important to emphasize that, remarkably, despite that exchange, another lawsuit was filed just on Wednesday that essentially reproduces the original lawsuit and includes the original affidavit that was dismissed as defective hearsay by the original judge. And so I think you look at that kind of activity by the lawyers, and it's hard to avoid the conclusion that this is inappropriate. So I think there's two kind of levels of response. One would be, are judges going to become so fed up or outraged that they will directly impose sanctions on lawyers for inappropriate conduct? You mentioned Rule 11 and the like. I think that's one possibility. And I think the other possibility, and the one that I am really urging, is for the bars in these states to step up into their role of monitoring and disciplining lawyers who cross lines. They do not need referrals from judges. These activities are now in the public record, and they do provide ample evidence of specific instances of misconduct. I mentioned the kind of broader claims regarding potential coordination between the lawsuits and the misrepresentations made by the Trump campaign. And then, again, at this other level, just thinking about what lawyers are doing here as fundamentally prejudicial to the administration of justice, which is a violation of their ethical obligations. And I think if there was ever a time to really take those ideas seriously and to take action in a way that would preserve the basic foundations of the rule of law, now is that time.
Well, we shall see. I mean, this president, before he was president, was, I think it was really part of his business model to use the courts in filing lawsuits maybe the most litigious individual who's ever served as president of the United States, and it is a remarkable time, and we shall see. But I thank you very much, Scott Cummings, for helping us talk through some of these things. I always ask myself, could I sleep at night knowing that I filed this in court? I mean, I take it very seriously, and it's deeply disturbing what's going on, and worrying about what effect this is going to have. So thank you so much for chatting with me and our listeners and helping us understand the issues. It's an important one.
Thank you so much for bringing these issues to light and for having me.
Great. Thanks so much.